The kind of knock that doesn't ask, it demands, shattered the quiet of my Tuesday afternoon. It echoed through my garage with the force of a drill sergeant's bark, pulling me out of my reverie. I was elbow-deep in gun oil, meticulously, cleaning my grandfather's 1940s Remington when I froze, a familiar jolt of adrenaline coursing through me. "Here we go," I muttered, bracing myself like I did back in ranger training. Peering through the peephole, I spotted her, a woman, on my porch, dressed like a budget Barbie lawyer, waving a clipboard with the confidence of someone who thought she owned Heritage Hills. I'd come back here to heal, body and mind, thinking a high school teaching gig would be my calm after a decade of training elite soldiers. Boy, was I wrong. Ever wonder what happens when fake authority clashes with someone who's spent years leading warriors? Stick around, because this neighborly dispute got wild, and it wasn't about barking dogs or untrimmed hedges. That crisp October afternoon, I'd been in my happy place, methodically polishing each piece of the Remington with the precision I'd drilled into recruits. The rifle, a cherished heirloom from my grandfather, a World War II vet who taught me respect, discipline, and how to care for what matters, always brought me peace. The scent of gun oil and the rhythmic motions were my therapy, quieting the chaos in my head. Then came that pounding, sharp, aggressive, the kind that screams trouble or authority gone rogue. Which city in the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've ever had a confrontation with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Hot pink blazer that hurt to look at, fake blonde hair teased up to heaven, and enough costume jewelry to stock a pawn shop. She was clutching a clipboard with what looked like official documents, but something about her whole setup screamed amateur hour. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitaker," she announced when I opened the door, her voice dripping with fake authority. "I'm Brittany Crow from Enforced Sure LLC, Heritage Hills HOA Enforcement Division. We've received multiple complaints about firearms violations on your property." She held up her clipboard like it was Excalibur, clearly expecting me to cower. Behind her stood this mountain of a guy in a poorly fitting security uniform, trying his best to look intimidating. The nameplate read Troy Bennett, Security Supervisor, but his body language screamed unemployed bouncer. I'd seen enough real authority in my time to spot the difference between professional law enforcement and whatever this was supposed to be. "I'm going to need to inspect your firearms storage immediately to ensure compliance with HOA regulations," Brittany continued, pushing the clipboard toward me, and that's when I noticed the first red flag. The logo on her papers was slightly crooked like it had been printed on a home printer, and the official seal looked suspiciously like something you'd order from eBay. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some proper identification and documentation of your authority before I let anyone inspect anything," I replied, keeping my voice level but firm. Years of military training had taught me never to show your hand too early, and something about this whole situation felt wrong. The woman's face immediately flushed red, and I could see Troy behind her tensing up like he was ready for a fight. "This is proper documentation," Brittany snapped, waving the clipboard more aggressively. "And if you refuse to comply, we'll be back with a court order and law enforcement backup. Trust me, Mr. Whitaker, you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." The threat was clear, but so was the desperation in her voice. I'd interrogated enough people to recognize when someone was bluffing, and this felt like the world's worst poker hand. "I understand your position, ma'am, but I'm going to need to verify this with the actual HOA before proceeding," I said, already planning my next move. "You folks have a good day." Now, after closing the door, I immediately went to my kitchen window to watch them. Brittany was having what looked like a heated argument with Troy, gesturing wildly at my house while he kept looking around nervously. They climbed into a beat-up sedan that had seen better days. Definitely not the kind of vehicle I'd expect official HOA enforcement to be driving. Once they were gone, I grabbed my phone and called Eleanor Green, my neighbor across the street, who'd lived in Heritage Hills since the neighborhood was built. Eleanor was 73 years old, sharp as a tack, and had worked as a clerk at the county courthouse for over 30 years before retiring. If anyone knew the real HOA situation, it would be her. "Eleanor, it's Dean," I said when she picked up. "I just had some people claiming to be HOA enforcement at my door, wanting to inspect my guns. Do you know anything about that?" There was a long pause on the other end, and when Elilana finally spoke, her voice was grim. "Dean, honey, we don't have any HOA enforcement officers, never have. And the woman you're describing, I think I know exactly who that is. She pulled the same scam over in Pine Valley last year." Eleanor's words hit me like a cold slap of reality, but they also activated every investigative instinct I'd developed over 12 years of military service. "Tell me everything," I said, settling into my kitchen chair and grabbing a notepad. "Her name's Brittany Crow, and she's bad news," Eleanor explained. "She used to be a real estate agent, but her license got suspended after she got caught in some shady deals. That company she mentioned, Enforcer LLC, I looked it up after hearing about Pine Valley. It's registered as Home Ornaments Advisory, which doesn't sound like law enforcement to me. This was getting interesting. I thanked Eleanor and immediately fired up my laptop to do some digging. Thanks to my background training document security for the military, I knew exactly where to look for public records. What I found was a goldmine of red flags that would make any reasonable person run screaming. Brittany Crow had quite the paper trail, multiple failed businesses, bankruptcy filings, and she owed over $200,000 to various creditors. But the most interesting discovery was her connection to the ATF. She'd filed 3 false reports in the past 6 months, each claiming someone was illegally selling weapons. Every single report had been investigated and dismissed as fraudulent. The pattern was becoming clear. She was specifically targeting gun owners, probably figuring they'd have valuable collections worth stealing. Troy Bennett's background was equally sketchy. Fired from his last 3 security jobs for excessive force, currently on probation for assault, and apparently Brittany's live-in boyfriend. These 2 weren't just amateurs, they were desperate amateurs, which made them potentially dangerous. The next morning, I was reviewing my findings when my doorbell camera alert went off. There was Brittany again, this time dressed in what I assume she thought looked more official. A navy blue blazer with fake badges pinned all over it like she was auditioning for a community theatre production of Generic Authority Figure No. 3. She was alone this time, carrying an even thicker stack of papers and wearing the kind of smug expression that told me she thought she'd won the lottery. "Mr. Whitaker," she called through the door, "I have a court order here requiring immediate inspection of all firearms on the premises. You need to open this door right now or I'll have to call for police backup." I opened the door and took the document she thrust at me. And that's when I nearly burst out laughing. This woman had actually tried to create a fake court order using Comic Sans font. Comic Sans. I'd seen kindergarten newsletters with more authority than this document. "Ma'am, I have to ask what court issued this order," I said, struggling to keep a straight face. The County Court of Heritage Hills," she replied, clearly making it up as she went along. "Judge Thompson signed it personally." Judge Thompson. I happened to know that our county's judges were named Martinez, Johnson, and Wu. There was no Judge Thompson, and there definitely wasn't a county court of Heritage Hills. We fell under Travis County jurisdiction, but the real kicker was the signature at the bottom. I'd seen enough forged documents in my military career to spot a fake signature, and this one was laughably bad. It looked like she'd practiced writing Judge Thompson about 5 times and picked the best attempt. "I'm going to need to verify this with the court," I told her, pulling out my phone. "You can't do that," she practically shouted. "This is an active investigation, and any interference could be considered obstruction of justice." That's when I knew she was getting desperate. Real law enforcement doesn't get panicky when you want to verify their paperwork. They encourage it. I made a show of dialing the courthouse while watching her face go through about 6 different shades of red. "Hello, Travis County Courthouse. I need to verify a court order, supposedly signed by Judge Thompson." Brittany's eyes went wide and she actually took a step backward. "You know what, Mr. Whitaker? I think there might have been some confusion with the paperwork. Let me go back to the office and get this sorted out. We'll be in touch." She practically ran back to her car, clutching her fake documents like they were evidence of her crime, which technically they were. I watched her drive away while staying on the phone with the courthouse. "Actually, never mind about that court order," I told the clerk. "But could you tell me if we have a Judge Thompson in Travis County?" "No, sir, we don't," came the reply. "And if someone's showing you fake court orders, you might want to call the sheriff's department." At school the next day, I found myself using this experience as a teaching moment for my American history classes. The difference between law and morality, I explained to my third seniors, is that law is what people in power say you have to do. Morality is what you know is right. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. Your job as citizens is to know the difference. One student raised her hand. "Mr. Whitaker, what made you think about this today?" I smiled. Let's just say that sometimes the lessons come to us when we least expect them. That evening, I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach. Instead of waiting for Brittany to make her next move, I was going to set a trap. I called the number on her fake business card and left a message. "This is Dean Whitaker. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to cooperate with the HOA requirements. Could you come by this weekend to do the official inspection? I'd prefer to get this resolved quickly." It was time to see just how far these two were willing to push their little scam, and more importantly, it was time to start gathering the evidence I'd need to put them away for good. Friday afternoon, I was in my garage doing what had become my daily ritual of cleaning and organizing my grandfather's gun collection, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, tucked behind my air filter unit, was a small wireless camera about the size of a quarter, practically invisible unless you knew what to look for. The model looked like something you could buy online for about $50, the kind of cheap surveillance gear that amateur stalkers use to spy on people, but finding it there meant that Brittany and Troy hadn't just stumbled onto my property by accident. They'd been watching me, studying my routines, probably cataloging every valuable item they could see through the windows. This wasn't just a random scam. This was a targeted operation, and I was starting to understand just how deep this rabbit hole went. I left the camera exactly where it was, but started behaving differently, making sure to block its view whenever. I handled anything valuable and being careful about what I said within earshot. Meanwhile, I set up my own surveillance system. 3 discrete cameras positioned to capture every angle of my front door and driveway, plus audio recording equipment that would pick up every word of our upcoming conversation. If Brittany and Troy wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had all the evidence I needed to end those games permanently. I also called Elilana and asked if she'd be willing to serve as a witness to whatever was about to go down. "Honey, I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask me to help catch some criminals," she said with obvious excitement. Saturday morning arrived with crisp October air, but I had a feeling the day was going to be anything but peaceful. Right, On schedule at exactly 10 a.m., Brittany's beat-up sedan pulled into my driveway. This time, she'd brought reinforcements. Troy was there, plus 2 additional people who looked nervous and confused. Brittany had clearly upgraded her costume, adding what appeared to be a fake badge and a utility belt that probably came from a Halloween store. Troy was wearing sunglasses indoors and trying to look intimidating, but mostly succeeding in looking like a discount store security guard having a midlife crisis. "Mr. Whitaker," Brittany announced as she approached my door, "we're here for the official compliance inspection. I trust you have all your firearms properly secured and documented according to HOA regulations. I invited them all inside, making sure to guide them through the exact pass where my cameras would capture the best footage." The 2 additional people introduced themselves as Mike and Sarah, and from their body language, I could tell they weren't part of the original scam. They seemed genuinely confused about what they were supposed to be doing there, referring to Brittany as their supervisor, and asking questions that made it clear they thought they were working for a legitimate company. It was becoming obvious that Mike and Sarah were victims too. Probably people desperate for work who'd responded to some fake job posting and were now being used as props to make Brittany's operation look more official. "Before we begin," I said, pulling out my phone, "I'd like to record this inspection for my own records. I hope that's not a problem." Troy immediately stepped forward, his hand moving toward his belt like he was reaching for a weapon. "That won't be necessary," he growled, trying to sound authoritative. "This is an official investigation and recording could compromise our procedures. That was mistake number 1. Real law enforcement encourages citizens to record interactions because it protects everyone involved. Only people with something to hide object to being recorded." "Actually, Texas is a one-party consent state," I replied calmly, "which means I can record any conversation I'm a part of, and since this is my property, I have every right to document what happens here." Brittany shot Troy a look that could have melted steel, clearly frustrated that he was escalating things too quickly. "Let's just get this over with," she said, consulting her clipboard with exaggerated authority. "We need to see all firearms, ammunition, and related storage equipment. Additionally, there's been a complaint about unlicensed valuable items on the property, so we'll need to document those as well." There it was, the real reason for this whole charade. They weren't just after my guns, they wanted to catalogue everything valuable in my house so they could come back later and steal it. "I'm also going to need you to pay the inspection fee," Brittany continued, $8,000 to cover processing and compliance costs. $8,000 for a fake inspection from fake authority figures with fake paperwork. I had to admire the sheer audacity, even as I was calculating exactly how many felonies they were committing in real time. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Eleanor's voice calling from my front door. "Dean, honey, I brought those HOA documents you asked for, the real ones." Eleanor walked in carrying a manila folder, thick with official papers, and the look on her face when she saw the tense situation was priceless.
"Oh my," she said with theatrical innocence, "am I interrupting something official?" What I didn't know yet was that Eleanor had already made a phone call that was about to change everything, and that Brittany was about to make the kind of desperate
mistake that would expose the full scope of her criminal operation. What happened next was like watching a masterclass in how not to handle a criminal situation. Brittany was frantically trying to call her backup while I kept Troy positioned where my cameras could record everything. Mike and Sarah were pressed against my living room wall looking like they wanted to disappear, and Eleanor was standing in my doorway with a folder full of actual HOA documents and the expression of someone who just walked into the world's most entertaining amateur theatre production. "Mom, you need to leave immediately," Brittany barked at Eleanor, trying to regain control of a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond her abilities. This is an active law enforcement operation, and civilian interference is a federal crime. Eleanor looked at Brittany with the kind of patient smile usually reserved for small children who've just said something adorable and completely wrong. "Tweety," Eleanor replied in her most grandmotherly voice. "I worked at the county courthouse for 32 years. I know what law enforcement looks like." "And honey, this ain't it." She opened her folder and pulled out a document that even from across the room I could see was professionally printed on official letterhead. These are the actual HOA bylaws for Heritage Hills, filed with the county and properly notarized. Would you like me to read the section about firearms? Because it says, individual property owners maintain full authority over personal property within their residences, subject only to federal and state law. The color drained from Brittany's face as Eleanor continued. It also says that any inspections must be requested in writing with 72 hours notice and can only be conducted by licensed professionals with proper insurance and bonding. Do you have those credentials, dear? Troy was getting agitated, so I maneuvered him into the perfect position, where my cameras would capture both video and audio clearly. "You're making a big mistake, man," he said, trying to sound threatening. "We've got backup coming, and when they get here, you're going to be in serious trouble." That's when he made his catastrophic mistake. In his desperation to sound intimidating, Troy let slip something that revealed the entire scope of their operation. "Brittany's got this whole thing planned out," he shouted. "She wrote scripts for all of us, told us exactly what to say to make people pay up." The silence that followed was deafening. Brittany's face went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of realizing your accomplice is an idiot. While Mike and Sarah exchanged looks that clearly said they were understanding for the first time that they'd been recruited as unwitting participants in a criminal conspiracy. "Troy, you absolute!" Brittany screamed, abandoning any pretense of professionalism. "Shut your mouth right now." But it was too late. The mask was off, the scam was exposed, and everyone in the room now understood exactly what had been happening. Eleanor was taking notes in a little spiral notebook. Mike was starting to back toward the door, and Sarah was pulling out her phone, probably to call someone who could explain how she'd ended up in the middle of what was clearly a home invasion disguised as an official inspection. "Ma'am," I said, to Brittany, keeping my voice calm and professional. "I think it's time we called the real authorities and sorted this out properly." That's when I heard sirens in the distance, getting closer by the second. "You called the cops?" Brittany demanded, her voice reaching a pitch that probably had dogs across the neighborhood covering their ears. Eleanor chuckled and held up her own phone. "Actually, dear, I called them about 20 minutes ago when I saw this circus setting up
in Dean's driveway. See, I recognized you from the description the Pine Valley HOA president gave me last month when she warned all the neighboring communities about your little scam." The sirens were getting louder, and I could see flashing lights.
"Through my front window. Officer Mallister is a good friend of mine," Eleanor continued conversationally. "Used to be a Marine, just like you, Dean. He's very interested in meeting people who impersonate law enforcement officers." The police cruiser pulled into my driveway just as Brittany made one last, desperate play. She reached into her oversized purse and pulled out another thick folder, this one apparently containing what she thought was her trump card.
"I have evidence," she shouted toward the front door. "Evidence that this man is engaged in illegal weapons trafficking. I've been investigating him for weeks." She waved the folder like it contained state secrets. "He's got enough weapons in there
To supply a small army, and none of it's properly registered. It was a bold move. I had to give her that. Unfortunately for Brittany, it was also completely wrong and about to backfire in ways she couldn't possibly have anticipated. Officer Mallister was about 6'2", built like someone who still hit the gym regularly despite being in his 40s, and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd served in combat. When he walked through my front door and saw the scene, Troy looking desperate, Brittany clutching her fake documents, and Eleanor standing there with her notebook like she was covering the story for the local newspaper. His expression went through several distinct phases. First was confusion, then recognition as his eyes met mine, then what I can only describe as professional amusement as he began to piece together what was actually happening. "Afternoon, folks," he said, in the kind of calm, authoritative voice that immediately made everyone stop talking. "I'm Officer Mallister. Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" Officer Mallister's arrival changed the entire dynamic in my living room, and I could see Brittany's desperation kick into overdrive as she realized her window for escape was rapidly closing. "Officer, thank God you're here," she began, putting on her most convincing performance yet. This man attacked my security supervisor while we were conducting a routine HOA compliance inspection. "We have documentation that he's been storing illegal weapons." Hand. "Ma'am?" Officer Mallister interrupted, holding up one hand while looking directly at me. "Aren't you Dean Whitaker, the guy who used to train rangers down at Fort Benning?" I nodded, and I could see the recognition clicking into place. "Rick Mallister," he said, extending his hand. "We met at that joint training exercise in Georgia. Must have been about 6 years ago. You taught that class on document forgery detection. Small world and getting smaller by the minute." "That's right," I replied, shaking his hand while maintaining my hold on Troy, who had apparently decided that staying still was his best option at this point. "And speaking of document forgery, you might want to take a look at the paperwork these folks brought with them." Elilana stepped forward with her notebook and folder, looking like a law librarian who'd just discovered the crime of the century. "Officer Mallister, I've documented 17 separate violations of state and federal law that I've witnessed in the past 30 minutes, she announced with obvious satisfaction. "These people have been impersonating law enforcement, creating fraudulent
legal documents, attempting extortion, and based on what the young man on the floor just admitted, they've been running this scam across multiple communities."
Brittany's face had gone from red to white to a shade of green that suggested she was beginning to understand just how much trouble she was in. "Now hold on just a minute," Brittany said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "I have proof that this whole situation is being misrepresented." She opened her folder and began pulling out photographs clearly taken with a telephoto lens from some distance, showing me in my garage handling various firearms. "This man has been stockpiling
weapons, and I have reason to believe he's involved in illegal sales. I've already filed reports with the appropriate federal agencies."
"And ma'am," Officer Mallister said, his voice taking on the kind of professional edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin, "before you go any further down that road, you should know that I served in the Marines for 8 years before becoming a police officer. I know what legal gun ownership looks like, and I also know what fraudulent documentation looks like. From where I'm standing, you've got a lot more explaining to do than Mr. Whitaker does." Mike and Sarah, the two people who'd clearly been duped into participating in this scam, were finally finding their voices.
"Officer, we answered a job posting for security consultants," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. "We thought we were working for a legitimate company doing insurance inspections or something. We had no idea this was." "It's okay, officer,"
Mallister assured them. "I can tell you're not part of this. Why don't you folks step outside while I sort through what's actually happening here?" They couldn't get out of my living room fast enough, probably already planning what they were going to tell their families about their brief career in accidental crime. Troy was still on the floor, but he'd stopped making noise and seemed to be resigned to whatever was coming next. Brittany, however, was just getting started. "I demand to speak to your supervisor," she announced, apparently still believing that indignation and volume could somehow overcome the mountain of evidence against her. This is clearly a cover-up, and I won't be silenced by some small-town conspiracy. Eleanor laughed, actually laughed out loud, and started flipping through her notebook. "Honey, you're about to be silenced by about 15 different criminal charges. Let's see here. Impersonating a law enforcement officer, that's a felony. Creating fraudulent legal documents, that's another felony. Attempted extortion, breaking and entering, if we count that little camera you planted in Dean's garage." "Yes, dear. We found that too. And based on what your boyfriend just told us, conspiracy to commit fraud across multiple jurisdictions." The list kept going, and with each item, Brittany seemed to shrink a little more. Officer Mallister was examining the fake court order with the kind of professional attention that comes from years of dealing with fraudulent documents. "Comic Sans font," he muttered, shaking his head. "And this signature, ma'am, did you actually think this would fool anyone?" He looked up at Brittany with what I can only describe as disappointed amusement. "We've had 3 other communities report similar scams in the past year. Always the same pattern: fake HOA enforcement, fraudulent documents targeting gun owners, specifically. The ATF has been tracking this for months." That's when Brittany played what she clearly thought was her ace in the hole. "Well, it doesn't matter what you think," she said with renewed confidence. "I've already filed an official complaint with the ATF about this man's illegal weapons activities. They're probably on their way here right now." The room went quiet for a moment as we all processed what she'd just said. Officer Mallister looked at me with raised eyebrows, and I could see him trying to figure out whether this was just another desperate lie or if there was actually an ATF investigation heading our way. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you telling me you filed a false report with federal agents?" "It's not false," Brittany shrieked. "I have evidence. I have photographs. I have—" "You have nothing but problems," Eleanor interrupted, consulting her notebook again, "because I happen to know that filing false reports with federal agencies is itself a federal crime. And based on the information I received from the ATF office this morning, when I called to verify your claims, you've already done this 3 times in the past 6 months. The silence that followed was deafening. Brittany's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. Troy was making small, groaning sounds from the floor, and Officer Mallister was staring at Eleanor with obvious
admiration. That's when we heard another vehicle pulling into my driveway.
A black SUV with government plates and 2 men in suits getting out with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested they were here on official business. "Well," Officer Mallister said, looking out the window, "I guess we're about to find
out just how deep this rabbit hole goes." Brittany's face lit up with what she apparently thought was vindication. "See, I told you they were coming. Now you'll see who's really telling the truth here." What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I'd recognized one of the men getting out of that SUV, and he was someone I'd never expected to see again.
The 2 ATF agents walked through my front door with the kind of professional bearing that immediately distinguished them from every fake authority figure who'd been cluttering up my living room for the past hour. The older agent was someone I didn't recognize, a tall, thin man with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of federal law enforcement. But the younger agent, the one who looked to be in his mid-30s with the build of someone who still maintained military fitness standards, was definitely familiar. I just couldn't quite place where I'd seen him before. Brittany practically bounced with excitement as they entered, clearly convinced that their arrival was going to vindicate her entire operation and send me off to federal prison.
"Agents, thank goodness you're here," she gushed, rushing toward them with her folder of fake evidence. This man has been threatening federal officers and operating an illegal weapons trafficking operation right here in this neighborhood. The
Senior agent, whose badge identified him as Special Agent Williams, looked around the room with methodical assessment. His eyes took in Troy still lying on the floor, Officer Mallister standing with his notebook out, Eleanor clutching her documentation, and me standing there trying to figure out why the younger agent looked so familiar. "Ma'am," Agent Williams said to Brittany, "I'm going to need you to step back and let us assess the situation before you tell us what we're going to find." The younger agent was staring at me with growing recognition, and I could see the exact moment when he figured out where he knew me from. "Sergeant Whitaker," the younger agent said, "Dean Whitaker from the Advanced Training Program at Benning." That's when it clicked. Mike Barrett, one of my former students, from a specialized course I taught on document security and fraud detection.
"Agent Barrett," I replied, extending my hand. "Good to see you again. Though I have to say, these aren't the circumstances I would have expected." Agent Williams looked between us with an expression that suggested his day had just gotten significantly
more complicated. "You two know each other?" "Sergeant Whitaker was my instructor in document forgery and fraud detection," Agent Barrett explained. "If he says someone's running a scam, I'd be inclined to believe him." Brittany's triumphant expression was rapidly transforming into panic as she began to understand that her federal backup might not be as supportive as she'd anticipated. "Wait, this isn't how this is supposed to go," she stammered, clutching her folder tighter. "I filed official reports. I have evidence." Agent Williams took the folder from her hands and began examining its contents with professional thoroughness. After a few minutes of silent review, he looked up with an expression that suggested he'd seen amateur work before. But this was setting new standards for incompetence. "Ma'am, are these photographs supposed to constitute evidence of illegal weapons trafficking?" he asked, holding up blurry images taken from a considerable distance. "Those photos prove he has way more guns than any normal person should own," Brittany insisted. "And he's been having meetings with suspicious people?" Eleanor cleared her throat and consulted her notebook. "By suspicious people, do you mean his students from Jefferson High School, where he teaches American history, or the veteran support group that meets in his garage every Tuesday evening?" Agent Barrett was examining the fake court orders scattered around my living room. "This is fascinating work," Agent Williams said with obvious sarcasm, holding up the Comic Sans court order. "Tell me, Miss Crow, did you actually believe this? Would fool federal agents," he flipped through more pages. "And this business license for N4Sure LLC that's actually registered as Home Ornaments Advisory. That's particularly creative." Agent Barrett had moved over to examine the surveillance camera in my garage. "Sergeant, how long have you known these people were running surveillance on your property?" "About 3 days," I replied. "I found the camera Friday afternoon and decided to see how far they were willing to push their operation." Both agents exchanged looks that suggested they were impressed with my approach. "This has to be illegal," Brittany protested. "He was spying on us, spying on him." Officer Mallister spoke up. "Ma'am, allowing criminals to continue committing crimes while you gather evidence is not entrapment. It's just good police work. What is illegal is impersonating law enforcement officers, creating fraudulent legal documents, attempted extortion, unlawful surveillance, and filing false reports with federal agencies." Troy, who had been remarkably quiet, finally decided to contribute in the worst possible way. "Look, this is all Brittany's idea," he shouted from the floor. "She told me we could make $50,000 just by scaring some gun nuts into paying inspection fees. I didn't know she was going to file fake federal reports." The silence that followed was complete. Agent Williams and Agent Barrett exchanged another, "Look, this one, suggesting that their case had just become significantly easier to prosecute. Brittany was staring at Troy with murderous rage. Eleanor was scribbling frantically in her notebook, and I was standing there thinking that if these two had spent half as much effort on legitimate employment as they had on this elaborate scam, they probably could have made that $50,000 legally. "Well," Agent Williams said, reaching for his handcuffs, "I think we've heard enough." What happened next was like watching justice unfold and fast forward with all the satisfaction of seeing a complex puzzle finally come together. Agent Williams was on his radio, calling for additional backup and a transport vehicle, while Agent Barrett was methodically photographing all of Brittany's fake documents and equipment. Officer Mallister had finally allowed me to release Troy from the control hold, immediately placing him in handcuffs and reading him his rights with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. Brittany was sitting on my couch, no longer clutching her clipboard, staring at the wall with the expression of someone who was finally beginning to understand the full scope of the consequences heading her way. Eleanor was still taking notes, but now she was also making what appeared to be a phone call to someone she kept referring to as Sweetie and updating them on the most excitement Heritage Hills has seen since the Great Raccoon invasion of 2018. "Miss Crow," Agent Williams said, settling into the chair across from her, "we need to have a conversation about your recent activities." He opened a folder that he brought from the SUV, and I could see that it contained considerably more documentation than Brittany's amateur operation had produced. "Over the past 6 months, you've filed 4 separate complaints with our office alleging
illegal weapons activities. Every single one of those complaints has been investigated and determined to be false. That's a federal crime, ma'am, and it carries serious penalties."
Brittany looked up with what appeared to be genuine surprise. 4 complaints. I only filed 3 reports. Agent Barrett, who was still documenting the surveillance equipment, paused in his work. "Actually, you filed 4. The problem is, you used
a different name on one of them and got the state code wrong on the paperwork. That's how we started tracking the pattern." "Wait," I said, something clicking into place.
You mean she's been doing this to other people? This isn't just about my guns." Agent Williams nodded grimly. "Miss Crow here has been operating what we believe to be a systematic fraud, targeting legal gun owners across 3 counties. The pattern is always the same: fake HOA enforcement, fraudulent documentation, demands for inspection fees, and when that doesn't work, false federal reports designed to trigger law enforcement raids that would allow her to identify and catalog valuable items for later theft." He flipped through more pages in his folder. "What makes this particularly serious is that she's been specifically targeting veterans, apparently believing that military families would be more likely to have valuable weapons collections and less likely to question authority figures." Eleanor looked up from her phone call with obvious indignation. "That's despicable," she declared. "Targeting people who served their country, that's not just criminal, that's unpatriotic." Agent Barrett finished his documentation and joined the conversation. What's interesting is how amateur the execution was, especially considering the scope of the operation, the fake documents, the surveillance equipment, even the business registration. Everything was done just well enough to fool someone who wasn't paying attention, but not well enough to stand up to any serious scrutiny. He looked at me with what appeared to be professional respect. "The fact that you spotted the problems immediately and then set up your own counter-surveillance operation probably saved several other families from being victimized." Brittany finally found her voice again, though what came out was more of a whimper than the confident demands we'd been hearing all day.
"I need a lawyer," she said quietly. "I think I need a lawyer right now." "That's probably the smartest thing you've said all day," Officer McAllister replied, closing his notebook. "You're going to need a very good lawyer because the charges are adding up fast. Agent Williams began listing them off on his fingers.
Federal charges include filing false reports with federal agencies, mail fraud if you used the postal service for any of this, wire fraud if you used electronic communications, and conspiracy to commit fraud. State charges include impersonating law enforcement officers, creating fraudulent legal documents, attempted extortion, unlawful surveillance, and probably a few more we'll think of once we review all the evidence. The list seemed to go on forever, and with each item, Brittany seemed to shrink further into my couch. Troy, who was now handcuffed and sitting on my floor under Officer Mallister's watchful eye, apparently decided that this was a good time to try bargaining for a better deal. "I can tell you about the other places we hit," he offered desperately. "There's a whole list of targets, and I know where she keeps all the files." Brittany's head snapped up, and if looks could kill, Troy would have been a pile of ash on my hardwood floor. "You shut your mouth right now," she hissed. "Don't you dare." "Ma'am," Agent Williams interrupted, "anything you say right now can and will be used against you in court. You might want to consider exercising your right to remain silent." But Troy was apparently past the point of caring about Brittany's opinion. "She's got files on like 20 different families," he continued. "Photos, schedules, property assessments, everything. It's all in a storage unit over on Riverside Drive." 2 hours later, my living room had returned to something approaching normal. Though it would probably never feel quite the same after hosting what Agent Barrett had described as the most thorough takedown of an amateur fraud operation he'd seen in his federal career. Brittany and Troy had been transported to the county jail to await their initial court appearances. Mike and Sarah had given their statements and been released with assurances that they wouldn't face charges for their unwitting participation. And Eleanor had finally finished her phone calls updating what appeared to be half the county about the day's excitement. The agents had collected all the evidence, including the surveillance camera and several boxes of fake documents that would serve as evidence in what was clearly going to be a very comprehensive prosecution. Sergeant Agent Barrett said as he prepared to leave, "I have to say this was textbook counter-intelligence work. You identified the threat, gathered intelligence, controlled the situation, and provided us with everything we need to ensure these people never victimize anyone else." Agent Williams nodded in agreement. "We'll need you to testify when this goes to trial, but based on the evidence and their confessions, I don't think that trial is going to last very long." He handed me his business card. "If you ever decide you want to come out of retirement and work for the federal government, give me a call. We could use people with your skills." As they drove away, Eleanor came over with a plate of cookies that had apparently materialized from nowhere and settled into my kitchen for what was clearly going to be a lengthy debrief session. 3 months later, I was back in my garage cleaning. The same Remington that had started this whole adventure when my phone rang with news from the prosecutor's office. Brittany had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to all 7 families she'd victimized, a total of over $180,000 in damages and fees. Troy had received 18 months and a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 FT of any of her victims. The storage unit Troy had mentioned contained evidence of plans to expand the operation to 5 additional counties, probably representing dozens of families who would never know how close they'd come to being victimized. More importantly, for me, the Heritage Hills HOA had officially asked me to serve as their security consultant, a position that came with a small salary and the satisfaction of knowing I was helping protect my community. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with my grandfather's fountain pen, the same one he'd used to write letters home during World War II, and signed the official contract, making me the Heritage Hills Community Security Advisor. As I signed my name, I thought about how the skills I'd learned in the military had found a new purpose in civilian life. how sometimes the lessons we teach come back to help us when we least expect it, and how a community of neighbors looking out for each other is still the best defense against people who want to take advantage of others. And that's why I always tell my students, observe, assess, act. When you know how to apply those principles at the right time, nobody can fool you, especially not people trying to scam you with documents created in Comic Sans font and stamps bought on eBay. Have you ever encountered neighbors like this? Comment below. I'll be reading them over coffee.
And my grandfather's Remington.